Good evening. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library, located in Canton, Ohio. I'm so excited to greet everyone this evening on behalf of Jennifer Highfield, our CEO, and want to let you know that this event has been a long time in the making. It was planned as an in-person symposium pre-pandemic, allowing us a lot of time to think about first ladies and their role, almost two presidential administrations worth of time. If you're connecting with the National First Ladies Library for the first time, we're located in Canton, Ohio at the National First Ladies Historic Site, where we currently have 3 exhibitions on view: Defining Her Role, the First Lady's First 100 Days, Ivy Wed, The Marriage and Influence of Ida and William McKinley, and So Chic, The Life of Anne Lowe. If you aren't able to make it to Canton, we have several opportunities to connect virtually for upcoming programs and some in person. On October 28th, we'll host Aileen Weiss, author of The Women's Hour, an exploration of the battle to ratify the 19th Amendment. The book is currently in development to become a television series produced by Hillary Clinton. The First Ladies Library also offers a book club and film discussion program, as well as hands-on crafting and cooking with the First Lady events. Our legacy lecture and curator talks allow participants to get a close-up and personal experience with collection objects and learn about First Ladies from leading scholars in the field. Speaking of First Lady scholars, we are lucky to have several of them here this evening to discuss our topic of the evolving role of the First Lady. And before I turn things over to tonight's moderator, Michelle Gullion, our Director of Collections and Research for the National First Ladies Library, I want to do some housekeeping. This evening, we'll discuss, and the participants will share their opinion on the role of the First Lady and what the future may hold for this role. The format will be a moderated discussion. At the conclusion of the program, our distinguished panel will answer audience questions. During this program, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. The program is being broadcasted live on Facebook and is being recorded and will eventually be posted to the National First Ladies Library YouTube page. Should you have issues during the program, please communicate to National First Ladies Library staff via the question box. Due to the size of this evening's audience, which we are super excited about, the general chat is disabled. With housekeeping completed, I want to introduce tonight's panel. Dr. Lisa Burns is a professor of media studies at Quinnipiac University. She holds a PhD in communication from the University of Maryland at College Park. Dr. Burns currently has 2 books available: Media Relations and the Modern First Lady, From Jacqueline Kennedy to Melania Trump, and First Ladies and the Fourth Estate, Press Framing of Presidential Wives. She has also published several journal articles and book chapters on First Ladies. Her research interests include political communication, particularly media coverage of U.S. First Ladies and presidents, public memory, and media criticism. She frequently serves as a media expert on topics including First Ladies, women in politics, and presidential campaign coverage. Dr. Teri Finneman is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kansas. She previously worked as a political reporter and multimedia correspondent. Her research focuses on news coverage of U.S. First Ladies and women politicians. She also conducts research related to media ethics, journalism, history, and oral history. She is the author of Press Portrayals of Women Politicians, 1870 to 2000s, which was named a 2016 finalist for the Frank Luther Mott Kappa Tau Alpha Book Award for Best Research-Based Book about Journalism or Mass Communication. She has contributed chapters about First Ladies to Southern First Ladies, Changing America's Compass, and a companion to First Ladies. She is chairwoman of the AEJMC History Division, a national organization of journalism historians, and executive producer of the podcast Journalism History. Dr. Katherine Sibley is a professor of history and director of American Studies at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Her work on American First Ladies has been featured on C-SPAN, in The Guardian, and on Ladies First podcast. Dr. Sibley edited a volume that addressed presidential wives and surrogates from Martha Washington to Michelle Obama. A companion to First Ladies, her earlier book, First Lady Florence Harding, Behind the Tragedy and Controversy, which led her to write and perform a short play on Florence Harding's life. Her most recent book is Southern First Ladies, Changing America's Compass. Dr. Sibley received her BA, MA, and PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and served for more than a dozen years on the Historical Advisory Committee for the U.S. Department of State. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Historians of American Communism and also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of American Communist History. Last but not least, including the Guittard Book Prize for Why We Fight, the D.B. Hardeman Prize for the Best Book on Congress for her biography of Wright Patman. And without further ado, I also want to introduce one of my very favorite First Lady historians, Michelle Gullion, the Director of Collections and Research at the National First Ladies Library. I'm going to turn things over to Michelle, who is moderating our conversation this evening. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm so excited.
Me too. Thank you, Allison. I share my enthusiasm. I'm so honored tonight to be with such wonderful scholarly ladies. And I hope that you'll turn on I can't see you. So I hope that you'll turn on your pretty faces there so we can see all of you. And I want to get started right away and just let's plunge in. We have so many wonderful questions and things that we wanted to speak to you about. Let's get started with a quote by President Harry Truman. He once said, and I quote, "I hope someday someone will take the time to evaluate the true role of the wife of a president and to assess the many burdens she has to bear and contributions she makes," end quote. Certainly, like other men in this role, President Truman appreciated the contributions made by his wife, First Lady Bess Truman, during their time in the White House. To understand more, we should consider the historical context of the role of First Lady. Dr. Young and Dr. Burns, can you tell us, how did the role of First Lady come to be? What are the official responsibilities? And how have some First Ladies changed the dynamic of the role?
Sure, I'd be happy to get us started off on that. So the position of First Lady is not mentioned in the Constitution or any of the other founding documents or laws of the country. So it has evolved, I would argue, biographically. And what I mean by that is that the women who were married to our first presidents played an important role in defining what the spouse of the president should do. That said, there was, I think, a couple of overarching themes to the early First Ladies, or what we've come to call First Ladies, and how they defined their work. The first overarching theme is that many of the earliest First Ladies happened, like their husbands, to be Southern, and so there's a Southern flair to the to the evolution of First Ladies, and also to First Ladies activism, because many of these early First Ladies were, according to the standards of their time, activists in a variety of ways. So they took to their roles the sort of patterns that had shaped their lives prior to their husbands becoming president, and they started working on issues like hostessing, but hostessing for political purpose, and in other ways being supportive of their presidential spouses. And the choices that they made helped establish what become traditions for what the wife of the president is supposed to be. This changes with time as the opportunities for women to undertake new roles in American society changed with time. I'll give you one example from the 20th century, and then I'll turn it over to my much smarter colleague, Dr. Burns. And my example is going to be to make an observation about Lou Henry Hoover, who was First Lady during Herbert Hoover's presidency. And so that's 1929 to 1933, just to put some dates out there. And so Lou Henry Hoover had the advantage of education and had the advantage of having traveled the world. And so she establishes some new firsts for first ladies that become important for understanding the first lady in the 20th century. She has a policy focus to her work. It would look pretty tame to a 21st century audience, but it was fairly radical in the late 1920s and early 1930s. She also was the first lady to talk to the media, and she did it in a rather subterranean sort of way. She denied that she talked to the media, but she would talk to the media when there was a Girl Scout event going on. So members of the press could attend this Girl Scout event. And there was even one occasion where the journalist Bess Furman disguised herself as a Girl Scout to get into an event so that she could ask questions of the First Lady. And the final point of departure for a new role, Lou Henry Hoover was also the first lady to speak on the radio. And now a lot of that has to do with when the technology of radio came into being, and also it has to do, and I'm sure you'll hear more from my fellow panelists on this, with the predilections of the presidents who came before Herbert Hoover and what they were and were not willing to tolerate. But yes, circumstance does provide an opportunity for roles to change with the passage of time. And I'll stop there.
And I agree with everything that Dr. Young just said. The really interesting thing about the First Lady Institution, I think the reason why so many of us love to study it, is that it has been shaped over the years by each individual who has held the role. If we're talking about the more sort of modern conception of the First Lady Institution, I would point to both Eleanor Roosevelt and Lady Bird Johnson and how much they shaped the role. Both helped to expand the role of First Lady to be an advocate, although of course we saw some of that earlier, to be a surrogate, particularly for their spouse, and to play an advisory role. And so we'll get into some of these details with some of our questions later, but I think the biggest difference these two women made was the fact that the way they use the media. So Nancy was just talking about, some of the things Lou Hoover was doing. Eleanor Roosevelt was very adept at using the media and was being counseled by Lorena Hickok, who was a reporter, on how to do this. She was the first lady to give press conferences on a regular basis, and she made them open to women only, which was, not only did this sort of meet societal standards, but it was a way to give women reporters keep their jobs during the Depression, which was really interesting. But not only was she giving these press conferences, she was an incredibly active first lady. So she was traveling constantly. She was her husband's eyes, ears, and in a lot of cases, legs. So because of her unique circumstances, she was always traveling. She was in the newspapers. She was in newsreels. There were photographs. She was also creating her own media. She wrote a daily syndicated column, My Day. She was doing guest columns for women's magazines. She hosted her own radio shows. So you really couldn't get away from Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, that didn't mean that all first ladies were going to be like Eleanor. In fact, Bess Truman decided she wanted none of that. So we see, Bess Truman, maybe Eisenhower, even Jackie Kennedy sort of pulling back a bit. But it was Lady Bird Johnson then who really solidified kind of what we think of with the modern first lady. She decided to make the most of the public stage that she was given and sort of the first lady megaphone. So every first lady after Lady Bird had an advocacy project, or is expected to have some sort of cause. Of course, there's beautification, which we'll talk about tonight. Being a surrogate, independently campaigning with modern campaigns getting more complex, having these spouses out there campaigning for their partners. So we see Lady Bird doing her whistle stop tour, and then even the advisory role. Some were more public about it than others. But it really was, again, using the media coverage. So Lady Bird invited women reporters to come with her when she traveled around the country in support of the Great Society programs, to be involved with her beautification trips. And because the press helped to really shape public expectations, when you had later first ladies maybe not have a clear cause or not being as active, then the public started to question that. And so it's really, again, because of the media savvy of these two women that I think we see the evolution and the development of the modern first lady role today.
Thank you, Dr. Young and Dr. Burns. That's so interesting. Let's go along with that. First ladies, as you said, have focused on causes to advocate for. For some, they were political in nature, such as Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. Some causes were important on a more national platform, such as Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative, and others were extremely personal, like Betty Ford's breast cancer awareness efforts. How has this impacted the role of the First Lady, and how many First Lady advocacy efforts change, or excuse me, how may First Lady advocacy efforts change in the future? Doctors Finneman, Sibley, and Young, please share your thoughts.
So going off of what Dr. Burns was talking about, one of the things that's so interesting to me looking at Jill Biden is how many first ladies I see through her. I see the influence of Eleanor Roosevelt. I see the influence of Michelle Obama. And I have talked before about the influence of Grace Coolidge. There's actually quite a few similarities between Jill Biden and Grace Coolidge that are interesting to look at. And so no matter who is coming in as first lady, right, you have this range from Bess Truman to Hillary Clinton. And so odds are good. There is some role model in between there who is somewhat similar to your personality, who you can use as kind of a guidepost, right? I mean, we saw Melania Trump talk often about Jackie Kennedy being a guidepost for her and how she was approaching this role. And it's interesting how this special club, this special group of people, we know that they do this research on the people who came before them. And we saw the video that came out on Twitter of Doug Emhoff with the Library of Congress, right, going and trying to learn about it, a little bit of history, and he learned about Grace Coolidge and her role as Second Lady. And so it's just interesting to take a look at, again, at the span. I mean, going back to Sarah Polk in 1845 already, a lot of people don't know how extremely politically active she was, to the point that Carl Anthony wrote that the vice president at the time said it was Sarah, not him, who was the #2 political leader of the nation. So you go from that extreme where you have a first lady who probably wanted the presidency maybe even more than James did. She certainly made sure that he stayed on that political path, to going to Grace Coolidge, who Good Housekeeping called America's best known and best loved wife and mother. So you have this very gendered spectrum on the other side, in this famous quote that it's a safe assumption that probably never in her life has Grace Coolidge told her husband what he should have said or what he should have done, right? So we have just this fascinating range to build upon as we look to the future, and who these women and other spouses, or maybe not a spouse, right? Maybe making this a professional role. So just this fascinating history gives us so much to build upon, which is why so many people are interested in this conversation.
Yes, if I could chime in, because of course we are in Ohio, or some of us are in Ohio. So we would be remiss if we did not mention, of course, one of the first ladies who was very, very active. And it's so interesting. She didn't use maybe the press as well as she might. She did not want to be quoted. She didn't appear on the radio like Lou Hoover, but she was someone who was particularly interested in impressing the press about the White House. So she pursued them. And this was just one of her causes, the cause of sort of inviting people into the White House after a long time when they were not welcome. During the time of the Wilson administration, as you may know, he was very ill. Of course, Edith came to the fore there, but no one was really moving around too much in the White House, not no member really of the public. So it was closed off and there were a lot of sheep running around, but not a lot of people. And so Florence, when she came in, she wanted to invite the people. And this way to do this was to really publicize their folksiness, to have concerts, to open up the grounds, to have people in. And of course, this was really an advocacy effort, right? Because it was a way to bring people to connect with the White House. And unlike poor Grace, Florence was more, I think, liberated with her relationship with her husband, of course, with good reason, because he certainly was going off and doing some things that maybe she didn't appreciate. So she had some freedom there. And interestingly, of course, many causes beyond certainly, promoting their time in the White House, she was very interested because of course, this was the time after World War I. And she felt a special connection with them because of course, she herself had a terrible nephritis condition, which came and went, and in fact, greatly affected her in the White House. And very interestingly, when she had this illness in the White House, she was not afraid for people to know. In fact, she invited people in, her doctors, of course, but even movie men. This was something she did. She brought the movie people, the Hollywood people to the White House to kind of show them what was going on and also to show off who was coming. Maybe it was Einstein one day or Madame Curie or whoever it might have been. So certainly she knew about this, but I say most significantly, maybe for our discussion tonight about future causes of first ladies, the issue of veterans, which other first ladies certainly took on, Eleanor Roosevelt, Lady Bird Johnson, certainly Michelle Obama and others, and also her interest in women and women's political activism. She hoped very much that these newly, shall we say, enfranchised women, although of course not all women were enfranchised at the time, certainly not Black women in the South, but for those who were enfranchised, she wanted very much to see them be active. Of course, she hoped they would be Republican activists, but she certainly wanted to see them become involved. And this was I think, again, her activism goes beyond just promoting her husband or promoting their White House administration, but also and to think that Edith was only about closing the door. Edith was also someone who was very interested in promoting her husband's reputation. Of course, that's why she didn't tell all about what was going on there with his illness. But later on, of course, she had a long impact kind of fostering that image, right? She had his house and it was open to the public later. And she wasn't the only one. I mean, you can think of Nancy Reagan. We can think of course, Jackie Kennedy, people who promoted their husbands' sort of reputations after the White House. So very, very interesting. And of course, even in Ohio, First Lady Lucretia Garfield did this as well. So I guess I'll leave it there, just discussing some of these interesting causes, and I'd love to hear what Dr. Young has to say. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
You'd think after a year and a half, I would learn to unmute myself, but no, I have not yet learned that. Apologies. So I'd like to dig in to just a few examples here to further flesh this out. I'd like to start by going back to Lou Henry Hoover and her passion for Girl Scouts. Lou Henry Hoover had grown up as a young woman who lived her life outdoors. She loved the outdoors and would have no doubt been a Girl Scout had that organization existed when she was a child. And she was very involved in the early days of Girl Scouting, the founding of Girl Scouting, and had worked with that before she came to the White House. So it was very natural that Girl Scouting would remain a cause for Lou Henry Hoover when she was First Lady. Because her time as First Lady intersected with the Great Depression, Lou Henry Hoover took her views about the importance of Girl Scouting as an institution in American social life and merged it with her husband's philosophy for how the country should face the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover believed that solutions to the Depression should come first and foremost from local initiatives. And so Lou Henry Hoover tried to use her connections in Girl Scouting and countless other organizations. Lou Henry Hoover was a joiner. I don't know that there was an organization that she was not a member of. And so she tried to use all of those connections to engage local people in solving the problems of other local people in their communities. So that if a person from Canton, Ohio wrote to Lou Henry Hoover Hoover saying, I'm down on my luck, I can't get a job, my kids are starving, you know, whatever sort of problem. And there were boxes and boxes and boxes of those kinds of letters in Lou Hoover's papers. What Lou would do would be to pass that correspondence on to a contact of hers, perhaps in Girl Scouting in Canton or some other organization where she knew someone in Canton or knew someone who knew someone in Canton. And the directive was to find out if this is a legitimate concern. And if it was a legitimate concern, the request was for the members of that organization in the local community who would understand the local culture and the local problems better than anyone in Washington, D.C., to help solve the problem. Maybe it was, you know, kids having shoes to wear to school or whatever. And so she wanted Girl Scouts to play this important role in relief in their communities. And she held a special meeting of Girl Scout leaders at Camp Rapidan. That was the Hoover retreat to escape the most uncomfortable summer weather in Washington, D.C., located in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, just not far from DC proper. So she has this meeting at Camp Rapidan with Scout leaders and is trying to encourage them to find other ways to bring Girl Scouts into relieving the community of the misery of the Great Depression. So that's one important example of how a first lady took on a cause that had been important before her time in the White House and magnified it while first lady. I'll give you one other example from Eleanor Roosevelt, who we'll probably talk about a lot tonight because Eleanor was Eleanor. Eleanor, as you all know, had a very strong and passionate commitment to civil rights. And this was a cause for her that was proactive and reactive. And I would like to give you an example of how Eleanor was reactive to one particular crisis while she was first lady. And that crisis unfolded when Marian Anderson, the very well-regarded opera singer, had been denied the invitation to sing at Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall was, of course, run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, then an all-white organization, and the white ladies in the DAR did not want Marian Anderson, a Black woman, singing at Constitution Hall, and who knows what else was going on in their minds, nothing good. So this becomes a big brouhaha. And Eleanor Roosevelt, I have an idea. Let's bring Marian Anderson to another venue in Washington, D.C., where even more people can be accommodated. And so she works with Harold Ickes, who is the Secretary of Interior. And as Secretary of Interior, Ickes controlled all the federal properties in Washington, D.C. And so they arrange for Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial. And just to add one final there on Eleanor's part toward the DAR, she resigned her membership in the DAR. She was so upset with their handling of this. So first ladies could, I think this is an example of a first lady using the privilege of her position to make an important social justice point and political point about what was the right thing to do. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll stop there. I think I've talked enough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young and Sibley and Finneman. Thank you so much. Let's go along with you talking about bringing Eleanor up. In a recent book about Eleanor Roosevelt by David Michaelis, the following passage can be found, and I quote, "She should have insisted on a full and frank talk with President Truman, but ultimately she made a point of not admitting her influence. If a president must understand what he is doing and make it his own, so must a former first lady," end quote. Dr. Young and Dr. Burns, please respond to this question. Many first ladies have influenced the work of the president. How much of an advisory role have and should first ladies play?
So there's no one right answer to that question. I think every marriage is going to bring its own rhythm to the White House as to how does the presidential couple communicate with one another. And this is especially true because if you'll think about a presidential marriage, these are people. There are a few exceptions to the rule. Dr. Sibley mentioned Edith Wilson, but most presidential couples don't marry when the president is president. They marry much earlier in their lives. And so their marriage is, shall we say, mature by the time that so far the male half of the couple has become president. Maybe we will live to see a day when it's the female half of the couple who becomes president. But their rhythm of communication, how much do they rely on each other or not, has already been pretty well established by the time of the person becomes president. So I think those rhythms and modes of behavior are already set, and what will become of them in the White House, I think, depends upon is again biographical. It depends upon each individual couple. Now, that said, you could have a presidential couple that don't necessarily rely too much on each other, but are still very much in sync. Lou and Bert Hoover are a good example of this. Bert Hoover was not going and asking his wife, Lou, what she thought about this, that, or the other thing, but they were still very much in sync because they had very similar backgrounds as children. They had very similar interests in college. They had both been geology majors at Stanford. That's where they met. And they had a similar outlook on life, so that Lou did things that meshed well with Bert's agenda for the country is not surprising, and that she did them without too much communication between the two of them about politics is also not too surprising, just given the dynamics of who they were. Dr. Burns has already mentioned how Eleanor Roosevelt was Franklin Roosevelt's eyes, ears, and legs, because Franklin was limited in his mobility as a result of his polio. And that particular medical necessity in their marriage gave Franklin Roosevelt the ability to dismiss Eleanor when she gave him what he viewed to be too much advice on occasion, because Eleanor would routinely push Franklin to do more with regard to civil rights and to do more with regard to social justice issues. And Franklin had the attitude that he could only do as much as he could get away with the Southern Democrats, who were so important in Congress because they chaired so many major committees and held speakerships and Senate majority leaderships and all such as that. So he had I don't think it would go over quite so well now, but one might say charming in a retrograde sort of way of dismissing Eleanor's advice by saying, that's just the missus. I can't control the missus. And again, I don't think that those words would receive positive reviews in the 21st century, but they worked in the 1930s and the 1940s. The last example I would give is of Lyndon and Lady Bird. So we learned just how important an advisor Lady Bird Johnson was to Lyndon by listening to the phone tapes. We can literally eavesdrop on their many conversations because of the taping system that was installed in the White House. And so we hear Lady Bird giving Lyndon notes on his speeches and press conferences, and her notes could be very harsh on occasion. She would tell him he needed to slow down in his speech or speed up or make more eye contact, fewer gestures, more gestures, all those sorts of notes. And she could be candid with him. She could also play very important roles in giving him advice to help him overcome what surely might well have been some sort of mental health challenge that Johnson had. His personality was larger than life, and he could get very concerned and very depressed on occasion. And in 1964, on multiple occasions, he talked about dropping out of the presidential race and just not running. And this was after he had been nominated for the presidency by the Democratic Party, as well as before. And there was more than one occasion where Lady Bird just essentially reads him the riot act and says, Lyndon, you cannot do that. Your country will look down upon you. Historians in the future will look down upon you. Your party will look down upon you. Your friends will be critical of you. Everybody has made sacrifices for you to be here. You cannot quit now. And she just kind of pushes him hard in that way. And Lady Bird could also be soft. And that's more how we think of her. She played a role in the Johnson treatment that we all know about, when Johnson would cajole and whatnot his political allies and opponents to do what he wanted. So Lyndon might have been talking to a Southern member of the Senate who was conservative. I'm thinking here maybe of Senator Harry Byrd from Virginia, who was a conservative Democrat, and Lyndon would be pushing him hard in the way that only Lyndon could. And Lady Bird would come in and be soft and warm and kind to him. And so she played an important role in advising him real time while he was interacting with other politicians. It was a very delicate dance that they performed, and a very important one for purposes of politics.
Let me just give a few additional examples. I think that I agree that the relationship is largely based on the relationship of the couple. And in the case of, for example, Edith Wilson or Nancy Reagan, both of them made a lot of decisions regarding their husbands' schedules, and at times restricted access to them, claiming that they were protecting their husbands and specifically looking out for their health. Reagan after the assassination attempt, and then Wilson, of course, after his stroke. They also both advised their husbands to drop certain key advisors who they said weren't serving the president, that they were only serving their own self-interests. And so they both said very publicly that they were not trying to influence their husbands, that they were not political. And Nancy Reagan admitted a little bit after the fact that, yeah, maybe she was more political than she let on. But they said it was all, again, in service of their husband and protecting their husband. Meanwhile, you had someone like Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, who were both very open about advising their husbands. Betty Ford talked about the fact that she convinced her husband to appoint women to cabinet posts. She also wanted a Supreme Court nomination, but they didn't get an opportunity there. Rosalind Carter shocked people when she sat in on cabinet meetings, and that caused quite a stir when she did that. But she was also often a surrogate for her husband, and so he felt it would be helpful to have her sit in so then he could talk about those issues with her. Hillary Clinton, of course, we know that there was an advisory role there. It was Bill that originally said sort of the 2-for-1 deal with her. But then you have other couples like, I'm thinking of the Bushes. So Barbara Bush, Laura Bush, and then also Michelle Obama, who all said very publicly that they were not interested in politics. They were not involved. They were not dictating policy to their husbands. But they were very influential in terms of their husbands trusted them. They had very close relationships with their husbands, and their husbands definitely talked to them about work. They maybe were able to separate it, say in the home space with the kids around, but they obviously relied on them for that kind of support and advice on certain issues.
Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Young and Dr. Burns. Let's turn our attention to First Ladies and the campaign trail. Spouses have become important surrogates on the campaign trail and in support of presidential initiatives. I'd like to invite all of our distinguished experts to comment on this question. How has this role evolved, especially with the increasing number of male spouses in support of female candidates on the campaign trail?
I guess I can jump in. I actually I think my colleagues here will have more to say about the political side of things. I know a number of them have written some really interesting work on that, but I would just like to mention a little bit of the other side of the surrogate term, because I think it's such an interesting piece of this, which is the first ladies who step in when there is no wife. And so far it's always been traditionally, right? A first lady is a wife of a president. In fact, the whole term first lady implies you're a lady usually is someone who's married to a man, right? So we, we can talk about, there's some problematic pieces of that term right there. And we can maybe get into that later. I hope we will. But what I wanted to mention here was at some point you had first ladies who came because there was no wife, right? So probably the most famous one would be Harriet Lane, who served a full term. She was the niece of course, James Buchanan. James Buchanan did not have a wife. James Buchanan, I think, had a partner, but we're still learning the full pieces of that. I mean, he was likely gay. So as it turned, sadly, his partner, if he was his partner, died shortly before James came into the White House. Not that that was ever going to happen, but just an interesting connection. So Harriet becomes his surrogate, and she does many of the things that first ladies do. And the reason I kind of want to belabor this point a little bit is because I think it shows how important the position of first lady is, or maybe at some point first gentleman or first partner, whatever term we want to use, because these people are really someone supports the president, maybe carries out those social affairs, thinks about preserving the White House, also, makes sure that the president's reputation is ensured, kind of humanizes the president as well. So a number of these things are really keen, clear, and important. So one of the other things I want to mention is through the 19th century, you had a lot of these women, and of course, most of them are kind of forgotten. We can think, for instance, of I'm sure no one has ever heard of Jane, who was the daughter-in-law of Anna Harrison, who of course never came to the White House because her husband died before she got there. But even, there was Jane, okay. But maybe more importantly, there was Priscilla, who was Letitia Tyler's daughter-in-law. And of course, there was the sister of, and I think you've mentioned that in the chat, maybe Teri, the sister Frances, Cleveland sister, very interesting woman, published author, a sister Chester Arthur called Mary. And, I don't need to go through all the names, but I want to just mention how important it was for these presidents to have people there who could help them, who could do the important roles. And when they weren't there, these presidents struggled. So you'll see some ratings of first ladies, and they often leave out the surrogates. And I think that's a mistake, because the surrogates were important. I mean, many of them, some of them were, obviously not so important. We've kind of forgotten who Jane Pierce had, right? But she had one, believe me, she was pretty sad. She needed someone to support her. But nevertheless, I think they are key really in our story. So, but I think that my colleagues here will have more to say about the other kind of role of a surrogate that the first lady plays. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to take a look indeed how this role has evolved. So going back to Sarah Polk in the 1840s, she was a campaign chief for him, except for it was done in the privacy of her home, and people at the time didn't tend to really know that she was running the campaign. So while he was out on stop, she was constantly sending him letters with political news, how things were going over in the press, sending him updates, right? I mean, they didn't have children, so her life, his job, they were one, right, together. And there's a funny letter that she actually wrote while he was out campaigning. They had house guests, like she had friends and family staying at their house, and she complained that these people were wasting her time when she should be busy helping with the campaign, which I think is just hilarious, right? And so, I mean, she was very actively involved, but it was very much hidden, and just between the two of them, how much her involvement was. But I've studied the obituary coverage of Sarah Polk, decades later, one of the longest women who was alive after her term in the White House ended, decades later, she was still a former first lady. And in the press coverage at the time, in the late 1800s, they acknowledged, at that time, the political role that she had played. So it's not like it stayed a secret forever or anything. But, bringing this to more current times, it's very timely. There was actually just a story, I can't remember where I read it, but there was a story in the national press very, very recently, actually talking about Melania Trump and her decision not to be involved with campaigning, and how interesting it is how they play that, right? Donald Trump will often say, Melania says hello, and get a lot of cheers from that, right? And so their group of supporters has largely accepted that decision by Melania. But I think when you look at any other spouse for a candidate, they're not going to get away with that, right? So it's really fascinating to see that we have gone from an era where it was completely taboo for presidential candidates to campaign at all for themselves, right? I mean, with the Hardings and their own front porch campaign, right? I mean, they just stayed on their porch for the most part, right? To now we're at a point where you better be out there campaigning. You are a part of this campaign and you need to step up and do your part.
I'd like to take us to the moment when the first time a first lady campaigned for her husband solo. And that would be the 1964 presidential election campaign for Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater. I need to set the scene for this campaign trip that Lady Bird Johnson took solo. The trip was an old-fashioned whistle-stop train tour from Northern Virginia to New Orleans. And the purpose was to spend several days on train, stopping to give short whistle-stop speeches from the back of the train platform for local dignitaries to come on the train, meet with Lady Bird and her entourage, and the like, and then just to wave at crowds in towns where the train did not stop. So that was that was the rough definition of what the whistle stop was. It was going through the South in the fall of 1964, just a few months after Lyndon Johnson signed the very historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law that outlawed segregation in public accommodations, among many other things. So Lyndon Johnson, the son of the South had long wished for another Southerner in the White House, and that had not really happened much since the Civil War. And Johnson had been groomed throughout his Senate career by senators senior to him to make a run for the White House. And he becomes president and he signs legislation outlawing segregation. And so he becomes very quickly persona non grata with the white South for this action. The Johnsons, though, had what unfortunately today would be perhaps a very quaint belief that if you're running for presidency, you need to seek the vote of every American. You should not discount the votes of people that you think will not vote for you because of positions you've taken. And it was from that perspective where the Johnsons believed that they needed to seek every vote from every American, that the plans for Lady Bird to take this whistle stop campaign trip started developing. Lyndon knew he could not go campaign in the South, that it would be very ugly. The white South was so furious about the end to segregation that Johnson going to the South would have not been a good idea. And Lady Bird insisted that she do it. And she worked nonstop planning for this tour. This was not something that happened by accident. There were weeks and months of planning that went into arranging for the whistle stop tour to come off without incident or with as few incidents as possible. And early days of the tour, things went well. The crowds were largely supportive. Local politicians got on the train. They were treated to political gimmickry that was over the top. Menus on the train meal was LB Jello. That's just how kitschy it was on the whistle stop. But the more rural the whistle stop got and the more deep south it went, the uglier the crowds became. And so the signs were pretty hostile. Blackbird Go Home is about the nicest one that I can describe. Lady Bird received catcalls when she was speaking in various towns. The first time that happened to her, she held up her white gloved hand and said in her very thick Southern drawl, because Lady Bird was a daughter of the South, that this was her time to speak, and would you be respectful and let me continue speaking. And that worked on the first occasion, but at a subsequent stop, the crowd did not honor the white glove, suggesting that Lady Bird had lost her prerogative of claiming Southern womanhood and gentility by supporting integration but through her support of her husband. And so it took one of the male surrogates traveling with Lady Bird. And so here we have another spin on surrogacy. It's men functioning as surrogates. Hale Boggs, a member of Congress from Louisiana, steps in and essentially calls the bigots out for their bigotry and calls them a bunch of Nazis. And so that was that. Usually when you call someone a Nazi, that tends to end conversations. So it was a very interesting moment, and it ends with Lady Bird's arrival in New Orleans just a few days after she left Washington, D.C. Lyndon met her in New Orleans, and then he goes on to give one of the most important speeches of his political career to a biracial audience in New Orleans. And in his speech, the first half of it was typical boring campaign stump speech, repeated as it had been repeated countless times before and countless times after. And then he goes off script and starts talking about the importance of the South getting beyond race and the South understanding the importance of economic justice as the pathway to regional equality with the rest of the nation. And it was a brilliant piece of Johnson in the vernacular, making an argument that only Johnson could make. And Lady Bird set the table for him to be able to do that with her solo campaigning for him, breaking ground for first ladies, so much so that it has now become normal for a presidential spouse to go campaign for her husband solo, and required even. But Lady Bird does that for the first time in the most difficult territory with her own gracious style, and making the very important point that when one wants to be president, one needs to court every American voter, not just a selected subset of voters.
I think, as was mentioned today, it's not only expected, but it's really important for the spouse to be able to campaign, because campaigns need to cover so much ground and so many people that they're trying to reach with their messaging. So, we have someone like Rosalind Carter campaigned almost, most of her campaigning was done independently of her husband, because in 1976, one of the questions was Jimmy who? So they were trying to spread the message of who is Jimmy Carter. And she did so many speeches, media appearances. She would go on, they would look up what was the local radio and television outlets, and which ones can we get on to spread the message and talk about the campaign. And even today, with the more what you consider more traditional first ladies, I think it's really interesting that Melania chose not to actively campaign, that she mainly would give just very brief remarks, often as an opening to her husband, that very rarely did she do any solo stops. She did a few with Karen Pence, but really was not out there on the campaign trail. But even other reluctant first ladies, Barbara Bush, Laura Bush, used to say that she told this joke at the beginning of so many of her speeches that when George got into politics, the one thing he promised her is that she would never have to give a speech. And here she was, again, thousands of times giving these speeches. But even, someone like Pat Nixon also was someone who she campaigned mainly doing women's events and speaking to women's groups, but was incredibly active during her husband's campaigns, getting out there and spreading the message, to where now that we're seeing male spouses on the campaign trail, I think the role is really about being supportive. The goal is not to get you elected. You aren't the one on the ticket. The goal is to get your partner elected. So we see people like Doug Emhoff has admitted that he is Kamala's #1 cheerleader. And particularly in the 2020 campaign, we saw the use of social media. So between Doug Emhoff and Chasten Buttigieg, both were really good at using social media to put their spouse in the spotlight and to, again, just reach as many people as possible. So I think that even if we see the flip on the gender roles here, it's still the same role for the spouse out on the campaign trail.
Thank you all for your insightful comments. Due to your professional and extensive research and study on the role of First Lady, should the First Lady position be paid? Do you see First Ladies continuing to juggle First Lady duties and careers? And if so, will there be any duties that a First Lady should no longer be responsible for? Doctors Finneman, Burns, and Sibley, could you give us your thoughts?
Well, I think we're all kind of in agreement on this, so we can probably keep this one pretty brief. But yeah, she should be paid. The fact is that this position isn't paid is just a long time American continuation of problematic gender norms, quite frankly, that women's work should be free and just given out gladly. And that is extremely problematic. They are a huge public relations element of the presidency, of the country, quite frankly. And if they instead were hiring a public relations firm to do this, can you imagine how much that would cost? So it is high past time that Congress allocated money to this position.
I absolutely agree. And the thing we need to keep in mind is that the professionalization of the office of the First Lady, which really is, again, sort of a phenomenon we see develop from the 1960s on, where we're still talking about only sort of a handful of people working for the First Lady. But the First Lady does not need to pick out china patterns or do the planning for a state dinner. There are event planners that work on the East Wing staff now that take care of that. Signing off on it, yes, in terms of stylistic choices, but we certainly don't need the spouse to perform those roles. However, I think I agree. If they are going to perform these roles, if they cannot continue to hold down their own jobs for a multitude of reasons, then they should be compensated for them, because it really is a two-person career.
Yes, I completely agree. They should. And it's very interesting because, Dr. Young has written about this as well, the way that they have these staffs, as you mentioned, Dr. Burns, and they have grown and proliferated, but yet First Ladies like Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama have been slammed for having such large staffs. So it's sort of like, they can't win, right, for kind of delegating some of that work, a sense of their, kind of, because what is this role anyway? And why do you need all the support for this kind of role? And I think that's where, if it became more professionally recognized, they would be, the staffs, the larger staffs would be certainly accepted and understood. But another thing to mention, of course, is that the First Ladies themselves are increasingly professional. And when we see in their own lives, right, and of course, we saw that with Michelle Obama when she came into the White House, herself being a very active First Lady, and she did not work from Chicago or anything like that. And though, of course, Melania Trump had a sort of I think some kind of a fashion business, and she was a little concerned that it might, I think she dropped that after a while, but it didn't seem like that was something that was going to be compatible with what she was doing. But with Dr. Biden, of course, we have someone who is very keen to continue, right? Her work has never stopped doing it. At Nova, Northern Virginia Community College. So I think we're going to see now that maybe if they are working full-time in their own careers, some of these First Ladies might be able, as you're saying, Dr. Burns, give up some of that China picking and all the rest of it, and let someone else take care of that. So.
Thank you so much for expounding on your observations. Mrs. Laura Bush stated, and I quote, "The role of the First Lady is often seen as just a social role where you decorate the governor's mansion, the White House, or wherever you live. But I think that this view is not just for the First Lady. This is in general for women who are not taken as seriously as men are, especially women candidates, and that's changing," end quote. Doctors Finneman and Sibley, can you please answer the following questions? How is the role of First Lady impacted by gender stereotypes? And how will society's changing views on gender and identity impact the role of First Lady?
Well, of course, we know it's immensely impacted by gender stereotypes. My book is Press Portrayals of Women Politicians, and I studied from 1872 with Victoria Woodhull up until the campaign with Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton. And it was actually kind of frightening to see how little had changed from 1872 to 2008. In how they were treated as played out in the press and in that coverage. You know, and one of the things that's interesting to think about is not only how the role of the First Lady and gender stereotypes come from our culture and from media coverage, but quite frankly, from their own spouses, from the president themselves. So with the example of Grace Coolidge, Calvin made a long list of activities that Grace could not do as First Lady. She couldn't dance, she couldn't drive, she couldn't bob her hair, she couldn't wear pants, she couldn't do interviews, right? To the point that there's this famous story that her first horseback riding lesson became her last when Calvin read about it in the newspaper and said, "I think you'll find that you get along with this job if you do not do anything new." And so it's really quite striking to see, you know, the gender weight, right, that Grace was carrying during this time, and how not long after she was out of office, you know, then she did start flying in airplanes and bobbing her hair and doing these kinds of things that she was restricted from essentially in her role, not only by Calvin, but, you know, what Calvin thought was the political climate of the time.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to, you know, talk a little minute about Rosalind Carter, who I think really faced this very, very closely, because she was right in the midst, right, of this sort of flowering of the women's movement. And this was in the 1970s, and the ERA was something that she supported, as did, of course, Betty Ford. But Rosalind in particular, Mrs. Carter, she faced criticism from women as well as, you know, some men supporters that think of the ERA for not going far enough in a way that her husband didn't. So in a way, being a woman in this position, you often faced more attacks sometimes from women for not going far enough and the kind of bearing that burden. In addition, she was very interesting. She was a very active First Lady in a lot of ways that we don't always appreciate. You know, she took these roles, for instance, she went, for instance, to South America very early on in her husband's administration, and not just to kind of open a hospital or like appear at a funeral, but serious work. And people, you know, around her were thinking, you know, the president's advisors, you know, should she be, you know, is she really, no, she's seriously going to press the human rights issue and to talk about nuclear weapons and things like this. And so there was this sense that obviously she must be there for the women's things. And so she had to bear that. And I think later, when she got very active in her role as an advocate of mental health and spending on more, you know, national efforts for mental health, the papers were much more interested in whether she served alcohol at her party. So this is, again, this sort of expectations, well, this is what First Ladies do, and they don't do these other things. They're not really actively visible outside those kind of distinct roles. I think they, you know, they often kind of ran into these kinds of limitations, and sometimes from, as you say, their own husbands, Dr. Finneman, as well as from, you know, other women, which is really kind of unfortunate. And I think Betty Ford faced some similar kinds of flack as well in that famous 60 Minutes interview. You know, like, what, you know, you would do this with your daughter, you would do that. So again, this emphasis on, well, you're supposed to be a proper mother. And then, you know, Michelle Obama, when she came into the White House, and she was attacked by some feminists for saying that she was going to be a mom in chief. So it's sort of like, you know, you kind of find yourself in this position where there are these expectations put on you by some women and some men, and then there are these other expectations that also, you know, a lot of white feminists, I think, were angry at Michelle Obama for not continuing her job, you know, as a professional woman outside of the home and all of that. So these are things I think that women have had to wrestle with in these times.
So true. Thank you so much, Dr. Finneman and Dr. Sibley. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was asked about how the traditional duties of First Lady would be filled should she be elected president during the ABC News Democratic debate. Her response was, quote, "With respect to my own husband, I am probably still going to pick the flowers and the china for state dinners and stuff like that." end quote. Bill Clinton's response to a similar question was, quote, there has been a lot of talk about breaking the glass ceiling, and I want to talk about one barrier that has not been broken. I want you to support Hillary for me too, because I want to break a ceiling. I am tired of the stranglehold that women have had on the job of presidential spouse, end quote. Could our entire panel please speak to the following questions? What happens to the role of First Lady when we have a First Gentleman? And what impact does this have on women's history or the archival elevation of the history of First Ladies? Please go in any order you feel.
I'll start out with this. I think that I'll start by answering this question in the same way I answered the question about the origin of the role of the First Lady. What will happen when there is a female president will be biographical. How the male spouse, assuming that it is a heterosexual couple, how the male spouse goes about being in the role of the First Lady will be determined by the choices that that couple have made in an iterative fashion throughout their marriage together. So I think that that will be part of it. That said, there are plenty of examples that suggest the range of how a male spouse to a female president might function, and we can find them by looking to America's state houses. Having a male spouse to a female chief executive is not new to the gubernatorial ranks. We have had female governors going as far back as the 1920s when two women were elected governor for the first time in the same cycle. And I'll say, because this one of the examples comes from my home state of Texas, when Miriam Ferguson was elected governor for the first time in 1924. Her husband, Jim Ferguson, had previously been governor and had been booted out of office for bad behavior. And so he perhaps sets the worst possible example of what a male spouse might do in that role. So I would suggest that any future chief executives not look to the Ferguson example. Corruption was their game, and they were quite good at it. There are much better examples in more modern male spouses to female gubernatorial chief executives. And I'll just pick one. Dan Mulhorn is the spouse of Jennifer Granholm, who is currently in the Biden cabinet, but she was earlier governor of Michigan. And when Jennifer Granholm served as governor of Michigan, her husband, Dan Mulhorn, stepped back from his own career to run their family. They have 3 children, and also to be an unpaid advocate for all things Michigan. He has experience in leadership and the like, and so he behaved in very traditionally female ways to manage the household and to be a spokesperson for Michigan. He also wrote a letter that was published in Newsweek in 2011, I believe, and I'll just quote from it briefly. He said, this was a letter to their son. The choices Mom and I made to put her public service in front of my career and for me to lead at home left me vulnerable and caused me to rethink what it means to be a man. It has not been a tragic end to my manhood, but a wondrous beginning. It'll get even better for you. So I think that those are lovely words to suggest how it could be, but then how it will be will have everything to do with the particular couple that breaks those 2 glass ceilings together. And yes, I do think that the presidential spouse position will be elevated in importance when a man holds the position, and that will just highlight all of the many problematic gender issues that we have been talking about in this panel. I think it's also interesting to see to what degree will women increasingly step back from the ceremonial aspects of being first lady? And when will it be okay for a first lady to say, nope, not going to do that? We can hire professionals to pick the china and pick the menu. I'm going to continue being fill in the blank. Dr. Biden is certainly teaching, but she's not teaching full time. So it's a baby step toward a woman saying, I'm going to continue doing me. We saw a tremendous blowback, maybe 10, 15 years ago on the campaign trail when one of the wives of a Democratic presidential contender said, I'm not going on the campaign trail. I'm a doctor and my patients need me. I'm going to continue practicing medicine. Thank you very much. And that was Howard Dean's wife. And it was one of several things that did not help Howard Dean with voters, because voters were not ready for a woman who might become first lady to say, my career is just as important as my husband's and I'm going to continue doing my career. So I think that it might take a male first lady to make that a reality.
Well, I would say that if you look at the most successful first ladies in history, they're ones that they played to their strengths. They supported the administration because they knew that first and foremost, they were not the ones who were elected. They were trying to support the administration. And they advanced their own interests. They used that public platform to advocate for particular causes. So I think when we sort of see that reversal, that the successful first gentleman, or whatever we decide to call him, should do the same thing. What is the best way that he could support the administration? How can he make the most of his public platform? And I think we saw some of this with Bill Clinton. Of course, Bill Clinton was a very unique example because he was a former president. So of course, that is very different. But he did really try to pull himself back and play the supportive spouse on the campaign trail. I still, though, am really offended that Hillary said that in that interview. I'm not sure I can forgive her for that, because trust me, I don't think she was really focusing on picking out the China pattern if she was first lady, let alone if she were president. But I understand why she did it. It's just, it's offensive.
And I'd like to say that perhaps we might have sort of a sense of what will happen when a man is a first gentleman. If we look at Doug Emhoff, who I think is doing a really interesting job as SCOTUS, as I guess it's called. Again, this gentleman lady thing, right? So one of the things that as he's had to do also is kind of downplay his career, right? He's a very wealthy, successful entertainment lawyer, but he's not doing that now. He's working, I think, very part-time as a Georgetown law professor, and spending time going around supporting the cause of greater vaccines. And he's doing it kind of in a folksy way, again, I think, to kind of, not be too visible in the position, because of course, the second ladies and second gentlemen probably aren't going to be. So he's kind of more folksy about it. And he's sort of, I think, not super, visible, but he's certainly, as you pointed to Dr. Finneman, he's certainly visible enough. But I think he wants to seem like a regular guy, not some very wealthy, attorney. And I think, compared to the last second lady, Karen Pence, he's certainly much more visible. And part of that might have been that she was a more kind of traditional Christian conservative woman married to a sort of powerful conservative man, two white people. And we're talking now about a man who is, a Jewish man who is married to a first woman of color who is vice president. So it's obviously a different kind of dynamic there. But I think it's very, very interesting because we're seeing him, I think, being more visible than Mrs. Pence was. And also speaking out, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, about his wife in that defending way, which I think you alluded to with Teri, in your discussion about a judge's spouse, et cetera, that she's saying, for instance, I have a quote here, men have to step up and step up for the people that they love and actually show it, right? And he says it's manly to love and care about others. And I just love that. And I think, he really is a mensch in a lot of ways. And I think that that kind of role can be a powerful one, but again, they have to be careful because we're not used to, still to this day, right, seeing people in these secondary roles being too visible, too powerful, too forceful. Play the folksy card, be visible but not too visible. It probably will work better. So I also think that they play a really key role, just as Jill Biden did when she was second lady, in supporting the first lady. So I guess that certainly could be something that Emhoff could do, as well as the president, right? So they play that role as the supportive person. So I think depending on who has the role, some of these things will carry on. But themes that have been coming out tonight about the professionalization and how that could, liberate these people to do more on many fronts, I think will continue to affect the future of the first lady, gentleman, whoever it may be. Thank you.
Did everyone go? I've just been so enthralled with all of everything you said. This has just been tremendous. Thank you, Dr. Finneman, Dr. Selby, Dr. Young, and Dr. Burns. We sincerely appreciate your thoughtful responses to our questions this evening. Now we're going to turn to the questions our participants have for you. So Allison, can you read some questions that are out there?
We have a lot of great questions coming through from participants this evening, really savvy people. Some of them you may have already addressed, and some of you did a very good job of answering some of the questions that were coming through via the chat. So I greatly appreciate that. One question that came up is, what research projects are you all working on right now to advance our knowledge of First Ladies? We shared some of those books in the chat, and Dr. Burns has many of them in the background. But what kinds of research are you working on related to First Ladies now?
So one of the things that I'm working on is, as a millennial, I'm very interested in the Free Britney Spears campaign. And so I'm taking a look at hashtag Free Mary and examining media coverage of the insanity trial of Mary Lincoln and how she was treated in the media at that time.
Great. And I would just mention that Dr. Young and myself are just starting a new series, which is going to be First Ladies and First Partners. And one of the things we're going to be doing with that is inviting, of course, people to submit books about First Ladies, but also about those who are around the First Ladies, who may have worked closely with family members, but also, stuff Dr. Young may want to add some of her own points, and what the things that First Ladies have done that have made an impact in the, that's one of the things that right now. And I'm also working on a biography of Obama for the First Lady series that my Florence book came out in.
I am super excited for Teri's work on Free Mary. That's one of my favorite upcoming projects. There's another First Ladies researcher, Molly Wertheimer. She's doing a book, an edited collection on First Lady autobiographies. So I'll be doing the chapter on Eleanor Roosevelt with Maureen Beasley, who's was one of really the first founders of the First Lady research field, particularly from the media studies side of things. And I would really love to do something on the spouses, the male spouses from the 2020 campaign. I know actually Dr. Finneman and I have talked about this. Both Doug Emhoff and Chasten Buttigieg are fascinating, and I would love to do something on their social media presence.
So I'm working on a couple of projects pertaining to First Ladies. Actually 3. So I got interested in the Lady Bird special, which I talked about when I was writing about the 1964 presidential election. And I'm in the process of revising an article on that for submission to a journal. So hopefully that will get done in the none too distant future. I am just now starting to research an article about first ladies and feminism in the 1970s that will be framed around the National Women's Conference, which was held here in Houston in 1977. There were 3 first ladies in attendance at that event: Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, and Rosalind Carter. So I'm starting to work on that. And I'm also working on a book on the idea of the First Lady that will look thematically at the different roles First Ladies have played. So First Lady as wife and mother, First Lady as politician, First Lady as diplomat. Those are the sorts of chapters that I'm developing for that. And none of this is going to happen as quickly as I would like, because I re-upped for another round as chair of the department that just started a month ago. So, you know, it is what it is. But I'm also really super psyched to be co-editing this series, First Ladies and First Partners, with Dr. Sibley. So if anybody out there is working on a project or knows someone who is working on a project, do have them reach out to us. The series is going to be with the University Press of Kansas, which already has an incredibly successful series that is biographical on First Ladies. And so this series will go beyond biography to look at thematic issues that First Ladies have been involved with, as well as individuals around the First Lady. So we are very excited to be working on that, and we hope that people will start sending us proposals.
Thank you for sharing all your research endeavors. There were many questions about Dr. Jill Biden in the Q&A. Here is one that I'll throw at you very quickly. We aren't hearing or seeing much about First Lady Jill Biden in the media. Is this due to her continuing work as a teacher? What events in the future do you think we will see her participate in, either with or without her husband?
I would just jump in and say, I know many of you here are more communication scholars who know more about maybe her social media presence, but I would say that she certainly has a lot of things that she's very interested in, including her work on behalf of the military and the efforts that she took on with Michelle Obama. I mean, much of that is continuing. She's also very interested in girls' health and other issues related to that. So I think we will see her more visible on many of those fronts. Yeah, I mean, well, as we all know in this panel, right? School just started like 2 weeks ago, so she could be possibly a little preoccupied with that at the moment. I wouldn't doubt, but others may have some other thoughts.
I think the biggest issue is the pandemic. I really think that's what's kept her from doing a lot of public appearances that you might normally see. She is very active on social media, so if you follow her there, but normally, particularly where you see press coverage is when the spouse or first lady is out and about and they're doing a big event. That's what the media tends to cover. And they're not necessarily, unless, I mean, there are some people whose social media gets covered, but your average person doesn't get like coverage in the media from what they're posting. So I think that's why we haven't seen in comparison as much media coverage about Jill Biden. If we hopefully someday soon get to the point where we can have more public appearances. She has gotten some really good press when she has done visits to places. There's been really good coverage, particularly if you're looking for coverage. Jada Yuan does some really great work for the Washington Post. She's been covering Dr. Biden. And I also do think with teaching, I mean, we all know, especially on this panel, I'm sure many of you in the audience, if you're teachers, how time consuming that can be. But I do think Jill Biden's been pretty active so far. It's just that she's limited in what she can do.
I would throw in one more thing that has to do with the overall Biden communications strategy, as I understand it. Biden has purposefully not put himself out there on a day in, day out basis in the media. He is focused on doing the work. And so I suspect that combined with the pandemic, the Biden strategy of not being the story every day is also playing a role in the fact that we don't see Dr. Jill Biden on a regular basis. But I do think the pandemic is super important here because it has so upended every aspect of our lives.
Another question that came up related to women trailblazers outside of the United States related to government. So there have been prime ministers in foreign countries who were women. What kinds of roles did their spouses play, and how might that impact things here or future first gentlemen?
Anyone want to speak to that? I guess I could take a stab at it. It's very interesting. I keep thinking of the the film about Maggie Thatcher and and her husband. And that was a great film, actually. And I think incredibly supportive, active people, not too visible, right? Careful to be, as we've talked about previously in this discussion. I think Dr. Finneman, others, maybe Dr. Burns mentioned this, the idea of promoting your spouse, supporting what they're doing, being there for them, right? Rather than, and I think that's the kind of thing we will see more of. And it's interesting. I mean, and I can think of a really wonderful, powerful leader right now. Is it Jacinda, the woman Ahern? Is that her last name, in New Zealand? And I mean, she's been very visible. And I honestly, I should know her name for her spouse. I think she has a spouse, but I don't know it. So I think maybe that's a sign of his success, right? I don't know. It's an interesting question that your audience member is asking.
I think what we're saying, we're starting to actually, a few people are starting to do research in this area. The thing with a lot of international, they don't always treat the spousal role in the same way. So what we've seen is in many of these other countries, the male spouse just continues to do his job as long as it doesn't interfere in some way with, with the government. So like Angela Merkel's husband has really not done a whole lot. Like every once in a while, he might show up at an event. Jacinda Ardern's husband, same thing. Again, I'm not really sure we see a lot of appearances in public. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's just a very different model in a lot of these countries. And then the men have chosen to continue their own interesting careers.
One last final question that was offered in the chat related to first ladies humanizing their husbands. What kinds of roles have first ladies played in humanizing the president?
Yeah, I mean, and I think Grace was referred to specifically, and yeah, I mean, she absolutely did, and Calvin knew it. Calvin knew it. There's this very, very famous quote that's in his autobiography that basically acknowledges, she put up with me, and I rejoiced in her graces. So he knew it. He knew what an absolutely valuable asset she was. She was wonderful with animals. She was wonderful with children. Again, these are, she was a teacher. These again are the same kinds of qualities that Jill Biden helps bring to the administration as well, as far as connecting with everyday real people. Grace later was involved with World War II activities and supporting the war and the military. So, I mean, yeah, you can't downplay the significance of a spouse and how much they bring to the ticket.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. I have enjoyed myself thoroughly this evening. I wish that you were all here in Ohio with us so that we can continue this chat over a cocktail. But my hope is that post-pandemic, we will bring you all together again for a more formal symposium. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us this evening. In the chat, we've shared some links provided for more information on our speakers and publications available to you. In addition, links to upcoming programs will also be shared with all participants in a follow-up email, as well as a link to the program if you may have missed it this evening. Thank you again, Dr. Finneman, Dr. Sibley, Dr. Young, Dr. Burns and Michelle Gullion for being our gracious moderator this evening. This was a really delightful, insightful, and engaging program. On behalf of the National First Ladies Library, we would like to wish you all a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at a future program. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. Good night.